There is a kind of pressure that doesn't come from an opponent. It comes from history, from a flag, from an entire nation holding its breath every time you toss a ball into the air. One match, one legend standing on the other side of the net, one shot at something no player from her country has ever touched. Alexandra Eala is about to walk into the biggest match of her life, and the whole tennis world is finally watching. For years, the Philippines has waited for a moment like this. Tennis has never been the nation's game. Basketball owns the streets, boxing owns the headlines, but somewhere in the middle of all that noise, a quiet, determined kid from Quezon City was swinging a racket with a kind of focus that made coaches stop and stare. Alexandra Eala didn't grow up with a country's tennis infrastructure behind her. She grew up with something more dangerous, belief, and a family willing to bet everything on it. She left home young, training overseas, chasing junior titles, learning to be alone in hotel rooms, in countries where nobody knew her name. It's a familiar story in sports. The prodigy who sacrifices a normal childhood for a dream most people will never understand. But what set Eala apart wasn't just the results. It was the calm. Even as a teenager, she carried herself like someone who expected to be here one day, on the sport's biggest stages, even when nobody else did. And slowly, the wins started piling up. A junior U.S. Open title, wildcard entries into WTA events, flashes of brilliance that made analysts whisper her name a little louder each season. But junior success is a graveyard for so many young players. The transition to the professional tour has broken careers far more promising than hers looked on paper. Eala had to prove over and over that she wasn't just a good story, she was a real threat. This year, that proof arrived in waves. She captured her second WTA 1-in-25 title in Birmingham. She pushed all the way to the semifinals of the WTA 500 tournament in Berlin. She partnered with five-time Wimbledon champion Venus Williams in doubles at Bad Homburg, soaking in lessons from a legend in the very tournaments meant to prepare her for grass. Every step felt deliberate. Every result felt like a message. By the time the draw for Wimbledon 2026 was announced, Alexandra Eala's name appeared somewhere it had never appeared before. Seeded, 29th in the world, and for the first time in her career, walking into the most famous tennis tournament on earth as a player opponents had to prepare for, not the other way around. The first round tested her immediately. Across the net stood Renata Zarazua of Mexico, a familiar face with an uncomfortable history. The last time they'd played, Zarazua had beaten her. This time there was no contest. Eala dismantled her opponent in straight sets, gone in barely over an hour. 22 winners, flying off her racket like she was trying to prove a point to everyone still doubting whether she belonged on these lawns. It was her first career main draw win at Wimbledon, and it was only the beginning. The second round brought a story that felt almost written for television. Maya Joint, a rising Australian ranked outside the top 80, had just delivered one of the tournament's biggest shocks, eliminating tennis icon Serena Williams in a bruising three-set battle. Joint arrived at her next match, riding an emotional high most players never experience in an entire career. And for a set, it looked like the momentum would carry her straight through Eala too. Joint took the first set. The Filipina found herself staring down the barrel of an early exit against an opponent who had just beaten one of the greatest players who ever lived. But this is where the story of Alexandra Eala starts to separate itself from ordinary tennis narratives. She didn't fold. She didn't panic. Slowly, she began closing the gaps in her own game. tightening her errors, stepping into the court, taking risks at the net that braver players might have shied away from under that kind of pressure. She clawed back the second set. And in the third, something shifted completely. Joynt's fire began to fade under the weight of her own emotional high, and Eala's calm took over the entire match. She closed it out, and in doing so, made history, becoming the first Filipina in the history of the tournament to reach the third round of Wimbledon. Support for her that day wasn't quiet. Filipino flags filled the stands on Court 3, a diaspora far from home finding a piece of it in a tennis match. When asked about the turnaround afterward, Eala kept her answer simple, admitting that after dropping the first set, she knew she had to dig deep to find a way back into the match. It's the kind of honesty that has followed her entire rise. No excuses, no theatrics, just quiet acknowledgement of the work required. But history, as it often does in sport, has a way of setting up the cruelest possible tests right when a player is riding highest. Waiting in the third round is not an unseeded underdog or a surprise package. It's Iga Świątek, the defending Wimbledon champion, an Olympic medalist, one of the most dominant forces women's tennis has seen in the last decade. Świątek arrived at this stage the way she usually does, dismissing a former Grand Slam finalist in straight sets without so much as a flicker of doubt. And here is where the story gets its edge, the detail that turns this from just another Grand Slam matchup into something with real weight behind it. This isn't the first time these two have stood across a net from each other. Over a year ago, in Miami, a much less experienced Eala pulled off a result that stunned the tennis world, defeating Świątek during a breakthrough run that first put her name on the map. It should have been the beginning of a rivalry told entirely on her terms. Instead, barely a month later in Madrid, Świątek delivered the answer, taking her revenge in straightforward fashion, reminding everyone exactly why she sits among the game's elite. So this match isn't just about pressure, it's about unfinished business. It's a rubber match written on the grandest possible stage, on the lawns of the All England Club, under the kind of spotlight that turns talented young players into either legends or cautionary tales. For Świątek, it's about defending her crown and closing a chapter that a younger opponent dared to interrupt. For Eala, it's about proving that Miami wasn't a fluke, that Madrid wasn't the real answer, and that this version of her, battle-tested, seeded, hardened by a brutal comeback just days earlier, is a completely different competitor than the one who lost that rematch. The pressure on Eala right now is almost impossible to overstate. She's not just carrying her own career forward. She's carrying the hopes of a country that has never had a tennis player reach this deep into a Grand Slam. Every point she plays echoes back home, across screens in Manila, in coffee shops and living rooms, where people who've never followed tennis before suddenly find themselves invested. That's a weight that has crushed talented athletes before. The burden of representing more than yourself, of knowing that a loss doesn't just end your tournament, it ends a story millions of people have been telling themselves for days. But if her run this week has shown anything, it's that pressure doesn't seem to shrink her. If anything, it sharpens her. The version of Alexandra Eala, who came back from a set down against a red-hot opponent, fresh off beating a legend, isn't a player who wilts when the stakes rise. She's a player who seems to find another gear exactly when she needs it most. Nobody is under any illusion about how difficult this next match will be. Świątek remains one of the most complete players in the sport, a champion who has broken far more experienced opponents than this, on courts far less demanding than center court. History says the favorite wins here, and history is usually right. But sport has never been just about history. It's about the moments history doesn't see coming, the underdog who refuses to read the script, the young player who decides that today, of all days, is the day she rewrites what's supposed to happen. Alexandra Eala has already made history this week. She's already given her country something it has waited generations for. But somewhere behind that calm exterior, there is almost certainly a competitor who isn't satisfied with just being a good story. She has beaten this opponent before. She knows what it looks like. She knows what it feels like. And now, on the biggest court in tennis, in front of a watching world, she gets one more chance to prove that it wasn't a coincidence the first time. And that pressure, however heavy, is not the same thing as fear. Whatever happens next, one thing is already certain. A quiet kid from Quezon City just forced the tennis world to learn her name. The question now isn't whether Alexandra Eala belongs on this stage. She's already answered that. The only question left is whether she's ready to become the story nobody saw coming. One more time.